Welcome to Dave Makes Stuff. Today's task is some basic panel beating to fill in this gap in the rear arch. I'm going to skip over the inner arch skin as it's not that interesting, and we'll dive straight in on the outer skin as that's the bit that people see, so that's the bit that needs to be right. Now, the key to achieving a decent shape with simple tools is to work in small pieces. So I'm going to start with this infill panel behind the rear light. I've used a cardboard template to get the shape, and then blasted it out of scrap steel with the grinder. The first tool I'm using is an adjustable spanner. I've ground all the sharp edges off it so it doesn't mark the metal, and then it's really useful for localized bends. To achieve a good result here, I've got to pretend to be a perfectionist, so it's a little at a time on the bends. I don't want to leave any hammer marks or sharp folds in it. This next tool is just a brick chipping hammer. Again, I'm not really leathering it, but just tapping it into shape. If I do want to hit it hard, a mallet spreads the force out over a big area and avoids marking things. It's very much an iterative process. It's patience more than expensive tools that will deliver the result. I did try to learn patience, but it was just taking ages. But never mind. It's this piece that needs to define the crease where the bodywork meets the wheel arch. So the first step is to mark it up, scribe it on the metal, and then I can take it away and work on it offline. I'm using the big adjustable spanner again. It's particularly helpful because the handle gives you some leverage over the steel, and you can more or less just command it to move and it will. The downside to this is if you're too aggressive with it, what happens is that the bit in the adjustable spanner's jaws moves as you tell it to, but the bits either side stretch, and here that would be bad. Sometimes you do want to stretch metal, but what happens is you stretch it in one direction, it will start to curve in another, and we don't want that here. So there are a couple of good ways to avoid it. Firstly, I'm holding it in the jaws to limit its ability to move, and secondly, I'm only making a little bend at a time, working up and down the metal in slow steps, because then each local section never moves and stretches too far from its neighbours. Right, so the curve is there or thereabouts. We can take it out. The adjustable has left a few marks on it. We'll fix those with filler later, I think. In the meantime, it kind of goes without saying that having made the part the right shape doesn't really count if you don't weld it in the right place. Let's have a shot at that now. Start with tacking it. Obviously you don't want to weld while there's plastic components adjacent to where you're welding, or things will catch on fire or melt or do other bad things. So make sure you don't do that under any circumstances, you hear? And if you do, blow it out, like this. Then carry right on welding. I should stop having health and safety disasters. Now we've got this piece in, we can trim it back so that there's a regular shaped opening for the next piece. Here I'm making a rough cardboard template again. Actually using the cardboard tells you a lot about how difficult the shape is going to be to form. Obviously card doesn't stretch, so if you can make the card fit, you're probably not going to need proper stretching and shrinking skills to make the metal fit either. So here it's looking pretty good, and we can transfer the template into steel. I'd just like to point out this footage isn't speeded up at all. I genuinely do have a nuclear plasma angle grinder now. This is how we roll on YouTube, baby. Sadly, the rest of the process is still manual. And you can use whatever works, really. So here an axle stand is the right shape for putting a convex curvature in. As ever, put the shape in. When you think you're close, check it against the bodywork. And inevitably, yes, that ends reasonable-ish. The rest of it still needs plenty of work. We need to put a twist in from near vertical at the front end to near horizontal at the back end. And the important thing is that it should be nice and progressive, without any obvious sharp folds anywhere. So I'm using the mallet on a block of wood, both of which are quite gentle in what they do, and I'm moving the metal around on the block of wood regularly so that it doesn't put all of the bend in one place. Once again, you find yourself asking, why the heck is he working around that side of the car if the panel's on the other side of the car? And once again, I have no good answer. But the shape's clearly getting closer. That's the main thing. In the next shot, it looks like I got enthusiastic about putting shape into it at some point, and you can see a defined fold line. We don't want that. So I'm using the chipping hammer to form it over some scaffolding bar, because scaffolding bar is good for absolutely everything, and also because it has a gentle curvature on it. So if I hammer the steel down into that curvature, I'll get rid of the fold line. And now the bottom left corner that I'd folded down is about right, but if anything there's a bit much curvature in the rest of it. It is getting close though. So at this point I'm going to get the grinder out and trim off some of the excess. It's definitely recognisable. The front right corner needs a little bit more work. A bit of time with the mallet, and now the challenge is managing not to go, yeah, that'll do, get the welder out. You've really got to maintain your focus. Each stage is basically the preparation work for the stage that comes after it, And if you've rushed one of the stages, it just makes the one that comes after twice as hard and the end result half as good. Also, do your homework and eat your greens, and you can't go out wearing that. There we go, that's pretty nearly there. The next step is to take it from the point where it sits neatly on the skin, and through a combination of trimming the aperture and also trimming the panel, to get it to a point where it drops in and you've got clearance all around it, so that when you weld it you have a proper weld gap and the weld metal sits in between the panels instead of just sort of piling up on top of them in a heap, and then when you grind it all down you've got no strength left. The downside, of course, is that when the panel is smaller than the aperture, it just wants to fall in all the time. I need welding gloves with magnetic fingers, but instead of those big hairy welding magnets we'll have to do instead. Even now, looking round it, the clearance is perhaps a bit too tight in places, so we'll attack the panel with the angle grinder once or twice more, and finally we're ready to weld. Now, as any good body man, and also me, knows, it's important when welding body panels together not to let the heat build up too much. So I'm putting spot welds down all around the perimeter, trying to distribute not too much heat in one place. It's most important where you've got two different thicknesses adjacent to one another, because for the same amount of weld they'll heat up to a different extent, and when they heat up they expand, so they'll expand by different amounts, and then you weld them together in their expanded by different amounts state, and then they cool down and they shrink by different amounts and they bend into some awful shape, and then you're working out how to fix it. Somehow, however, I always get too enthusiastic when welding and end up welding far too fast, and to be honest, for the most part I got away with it, but round the top edge where the thick meets the thin, not so much. So if you're treating this as any sort of how-to, that was a how not to. So yeah, take your time, weld slowly, eat your greens, and I've told you before you cannot go out dressed like that. So, we're passing a milestone now. Structurally this is complete. Now the goal is to make it look like it came from the factory. Smooth, and with the detail lines in the right places. And it's the latter that makes the difference between an average job and a good one. So the process here with the grinder and the file is not just to get everything smooth, but mainly to work up the detail line that runs right round the arch and to terminate it in a way that looks credible. If there's a conflict between getting it smooth and getting that detail line right, go for the detail line. You can fix smooth later. Which we shall now do with some big boy ultra tough metal filler, I'll have you know. This stuff sets pretty quickly, so you don't want to mix gallons of it, but you do want enough to be sure you've filled in all the low spots. Again, you're looking to define a shape, not just create smoothness, and a big part of that is not letting the sandpaper just conform to the filler underneath it. You always want to use some sort of sanding block. To keep it smooth over long distances, use a really long sanding block, and if you don't have a power sander, you need to learn to sand at 3000 RPM like this. I'll perhaps show you how in another video sometime. Eventually, once you've gotten right round it, you'll have a mix of places where you've achieved the shape you're looking for, and then the odd low spot that still hasn't filled in. Or I did anyway. Your filling skills might be better than mine. But even if they are, I bet you can't sand like this, can you? Ideally, after each pass of filling it and sanding it, it should be getting steadily smoother and closer to the shape that we're after. As you can hopefully see here, the shape is smooth. It won't look smooth until it's in primer. For the sake of sanity, I'm going to miss out the rest of the sanding and filling, because I think we all want to know whether it's ready for primer or not. So here goes with a quick coat with the rattle can. Once it's thoroughly dried, we can think about overspraying it with the stone chip finish that we're going for the whole thing. To be honest, if I did it again, I'd probably have another pass at that detail line to get it really crisp. But to be honest, we're not going to SEMA, we're going off-roading. Or at least that's what I'm telling the perfectionist in me right now. In the meantime, Julia's diligently spraying the arches with stone chip, and with that we've got a pair of completed rear wheel arches. So I hope that through this video I've shown that even if you're not a skilled bodyman, you can still do basic panel shaping using stuff you have around you, stuff you have in the garage, and as long as you're patient, you can achieve some pretty workmanlike results. Hope you've enjoyed watching. If you have, please do think about subscribing, because that really makes me happy, and we'll see you in the next one.